Hello, we're about to start our webinar looking at the impact of AI in finance teams. People are joining us just now, so we'll give it a couple of moments or so. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, please do. We'll be getting going very shortly. So, welcome to this webinar. AI is in the news, in our lives, and it's emerging as a tool in the world of finance. So what are the benefits, the possible negatives? What effect will it have on traditional finance processes and roles? That's what we'll be looking at today. As usual, there'll be a guide available following the session, so there's no need to make notes. And please put any questions you might have in the chat, and we'll pick them up as soon as we can. I'm Sue Beardsmore, and I'm joined today, I hope, by two experts. We've got one with us now, Rod Chadwick, an accountant by training holding senior roles for 25 years and a former head of process improvement at the Royal Mail, now continuous improvement lead with Delinean. And I'm hoping that shortly we'll be joined by Peter Drummond, who's the VP of Sales with Quadient AP out in Vancouver. So welcome everyone who's there waiting to talk to us and listen to us. We're going to start with a poll. It's perhaps slightly light-hearted, and don't worry too much about the definitions because we'll be talking about those in a minute or two. Do you use AI accounts in your accounts payable processing and payments? Now, you've got a single choice. Yes, you do. No, you don't. Or you've no idea. Now, that could be because you don't know whether you do or not, or you're not entirely certain what you mean or we mean by AI. But if you could just take that poll. Do you use AI in your accounts payable processing and payments? You have one choice, yes, no, or you have no idea. And we'll see if we get some results in a minute or two, and we'll refer back to it. But, oh yes, right. So yes, 33%, no, 67%. And you've all got some idea as to whether you do or not. So that's a good start for the day. Right. So Rod, let us start talking a little bit about the background, what we mean, and that could be a variety of things. So I'm asking you. So there, people thought that some of them were using it, 2/3 not. But people are becoming with the concept, they're becoming familiar with the concept of AI and the uses it can be put to in everyday life. But there are many different platforms. So the conversation around it's growing. But in the context of finance teams, let's narrow it down a little bit, Rod. What do we mean by AI, do you feel?
It's a good question. I think it is something that's widely misunderstood. And the AI tends to get sort of uses a term synonymous with automation. And it's kind of part of that, but it's not the entire thing. So a lot of companies have some form of automation, particularly within their AP processes for processing of invoices and so forth, where they might have OCR readers to read and extract the data their ERP. But that's not AI, certainly not in terms of my understanding, if you like, of what AI is. So it stands for artificial intelligence. I mean, there's some sort of philosophical arguments about whether it even exists yet. And I suppose in its purest sense, it needs to be kind of sentient to truly be artificial intelligence. But in the context of finance processes, there's automation. There's increasingly what we call intelligent automation, which is IA, which is really just a bit more sophisticated in terms of the way we automate. AI is a bit different in that what really differentiates it from other forms of automation is that it has a data set that learns. So all different types of AI have something in common, that they're backed up by a vast data set. And by having millions and millions and millions of records, it can then start to actually generate its own learning and then use that data set to answers. But there are many different types. I think this is something that's not always necessarily understood. I mean, there's at least 8 different types of AI. You've got some things that are very specific. So what we call reactive AI, is where your system will react to the environment around it. So things like self-driving cars are probably the best example, but that's quite niche. Within the context of a business, there's something called theory of mind AI, which a lot of people do use now. Probably don't call it that, but that's mainly things like chatbots. So if you've got like an interface for a customer, whether it's a customer service thing or whether it's a help desk for an AP process, you can have chatbots that mimic the way that people talk, learns from these interactions and does it in a very human way, as opposed to something that's that's just very much rules driven.
Can I just ask? Yeah. Can I just ask there? Is that something that learns as it goes along, or is that something that's programmed very specifically to do a task?
If it's true AI, it will learn as it goes along.
Right.
Yeah. So what a lot of things that where it's very sort of binary, where you've got a set of expected questions and expected answers that come out of the back of it. That's more like an RPA type approach, but a genuine AI-based engined chatbot will learn from the responses that it gets, and it will build its data set up as it goes along, and it will refine it more and more and more, so you can have a more statistically valid sense of comfort in terms of what's actually going to come out.
Okay. And where are you seeing it being used most? I mean, we have people here saying that they're using it. Where do you most come across it in finance teams? Where are they finding it most useful?
I think increasingly you tend to find that there's a type of AI called unsupervised learning, where you can basically allow the data set to spot anomalies and spot outliers within the context of a database. So that's used increasingly in things like fraud detection, early in financial controls as much as anything else. In that it will see all the transactions that go through a particular LP, and if it spots anything that it determines are outside of certain parameters or certain expectations, it will flag them. So I think that's a big use of AI right now in the finance community. Within AP specifically, I say that it tends to be more sort of intelligent automation or RPA, where it's very rules based, where it's doing very high volume tasks where you can give it very specific sets of rules, and so things like processing of invoices. It can have elements of AI within that, in that it can learn from when it sees the different invoice and the invoice numbers in a particular place. When it's looking for it, it might be over there on this invoice for this supplier, over there for that supplier. You can have an AI element to that where it notices that, and then the next time it comes to an invoice that supplier, it knows where to look. So it can be sort of supported by an AI tool, and that's getting increasingly sophisticated and something that's been more traditionally very rules based.
Okay, so AI tools, AI information. I mean, a lot of it in common parlance, in social media, whatever. There's a lot of open source stuff, isn't there? Presumably, that's not what you'd want to be getting hold of for finance teams.
It can be. It can
be.
We'll talk about this, I guess, when we talk about controls, because again, what another of the types of AI, something called generative AI. That's the one where most people are probably aware or have heard of something called ChatGPT, which is again open source, available to anybody. And when we talk about generative AI, what we mean is something that will generate new content. So ChatGPT in particular will generate pretty much almost anything that you ask it to. I mean, there are specific engines for things like one called DALL-E that will generate images. You feed it text, so I want an image that gives me this. It will produce an image for you, which people doing presentations and PowerPoint and stuff like that can be hugely beneficial. Something called Kubrick, which generates film backgrounds, in the film industry. So there's all sorts of different generative AI tools. ChatGPT is the best known. The GPT bit stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So again, it has a huge data set available to it, and you have to ask it questions almost like on a conversational basis, and then it will in a few seconds give you a return. So it is something that can be used within a context of finance, but you have to be very aware of what it can and can't do, and also be aware of the skills that you need to be able to use it properly, because there's a danger that you can get some very, very spurious answers, and potentially you can compromise the security of your company.
So you need to know what you're about before you really are in a position to use this. So you need somebody who's expert in it, familiar with it, used to posing the questions in the right way. Perhaps we could move on. You talked a little bit about controls, and we'll do a bit more about that later on. But some of the considerations. So we know that some of the benefits are automating mundane tasks, productivity, if you like, getting through things quicker, and perhaps jobs that people aren't really enjoying very much anyway, and they can spend their time thinking about other things. But what would you say your top things to consider if somebody came to you and said, right, we need to get on with this, Rod, we need to use AI, I know it's there, we've got to do it. What do they need to consider for their finance department? What are the pluses, the minuses? Run us through some of those.
I think first and foremost, you need to understand what it is that you want to achieve. So you've got to have an objective in mind, first of all. I mean, you can just say, look, there's this new tool, we want to play with it and see what happens, which you'd use really for the more sort of generative stuff that's open source. But again, you need to have people who understand the potential outcomes of that if you get it wrong. But for the more sort of traditional, we're going to do a project, we're going to put an AI automation into this particular process. You have to have a very, very clear idea of what it is that you want to achieve. Understand what your success factors look like, understand your KPIs, what do you want to get out of it. That's the most important. Because ultimately, whatever you choose to do, however you choose, it's just
okay.
It's a very sophisticated tool to help you get there.
I think we're having a little trouble hearing your mic, Rod. I don't know if a different position might help. Thanks
Let's
very
try and
much.
move a bit closer to the
great.
machine.
Thanks
Is
a
that
lot.
better?
Yeah, that's fine. So the considerations, yeah.
Yeah. So understand what it is that you're trying to do. Understand what your processes are. So again, we always come back to, no matter what the tool is, whether it's RPA of some sort, whether it's more intelligent, whether it's more sophisticated AI, you need to understand what your own processes are. You need to understand how they work, their weaknesses, and the kind of the route you should always go through, no matter what tool you're using, is to standardize first, then simplify, and then automate. Because if you've got a very, very convoluted, complex process that's a bit dysfunctional, applying any sort of automation or artificial intelligence tool to it becomes significantly harder. So you need to get the basics right first before I think you start looking at whether automation works. But it's really important, I think, to understand what you're trying to get out of it. Are you trying to do something where you're going to free people's time up to do something more useful? And if it's that, what are they going to do? Are you looking to, I don't know, chase debt quicker? Whatever it is that you're looking to try and do with that tool, have that in mind first. Because ultimately, again, if it needs some sort of investment, people that are going to be making the decisions want to know what the payback is. So you've got to have a business case in mind.
Do people need to be wary of sort of drifting into using AI, if you like? Some bright spark on the team says, oh, I think we can do this with it. Let's have a go, without really looking at what it might mean, what the software is you're using, what you're giving up of your own information if you're getting involved in it. Would you have anything to say about that?
Definitely, yeah. There's a couple of points there. I mean, in terms of giving the information, when you're using anything open source, the cardinal rule is not to put anything on there that's commercially sensitive from your organization. Once you feed that information in in a form of a question into that engine, it's there forever. So once it's in the public domain, it's there, and other people can see it. Millions of people can see it. So we're very, very circumspect about what you actually put, and that's really why you need to be very conscious of how you use the tool and the way you phrase the questions. So when you're using an open source one like ChatGPT, the skill really is in understanding how to put the parameters and the rules around the question so you get the answer back that you want. I mean, one of the phrases is one of the disadvantages, and it's a great little phrase that's used quite often. If you're not careful, you get a normalization of mediocrity.
Yeah.
Because if you put a relatively vague question in, you will get a pretty vague answer.
Right.
Probably heard there's been lots of stuff in the press about university students and A-level students using ChatGPT to generate essays and so forth. You can do that, but it will be pretty mediocre in terms of the answer that you get back, and it's the same principle really in the business context. So yeah, so you do have to be very
okay,
very aware, particularly when it's open source.
So you need to specify what you want from it. You don't just drift into using it. Can you give us any examples of where you're seeing it being used successfully? I mean, maybe throughout a system or just in a small part of it. Can you, any examples come to mind?
Yeah, so I mean, so for example, if you have people, within your finance team, and I'm sure most people do, who, are most finance teams have some form of Excel use, where they've got, macros written and so forth, and increasingly people are using things like Power BI, VB, to produce dashboards and reporting and budgeting forecasting systems. If you've got somebody in the team that actually can do that VB programming, it can be quite time consuming. So, I mean, again, someone in my team uses it quite extensively, ChatGPT, to speed up the programming. So, again, if you know what you're doing with it, you know what question, how to phrase it, and you say, right, I want to produce X, Y, and Z in this format with these columns and these rows in VB, and pose the question, it will come back with the VB code that you can then
Right.
sort of cut and paste into the generator, so you're not having to do everything from scratch. Similar thing with Excel. If you've got something you need to do, you don't know how to actually formulate the actual formula within it. You can get answers out of ChatGPT to do that. So it's very powerful in terms of what it can do to help you speed up those sort of fairly mundane processes. So people can do it, but it takes a long time.
Right.
Also, things like if you're producing documentation, training documents tend to be a bit dry and a bit time consuming. Again, you can use the tool to give you a framework to speed up that process. So
Yeah, but you need to know what you're looking for as the end result to know whether you've got a good product, presumably. I mean, you can't
absolutely,
just
yeah,
trust it to do the job for you and then say, here we are, tick.
yeah. Because if you're not careful, it ends up being sort of a black box, where you've got stuff that goes in, no idea what goes in the middle, and if something comes out, and you end up just cooking it, and that's the dangerous thing unless you know exactly what it is that you're expecting. So yeah, you need to understand what you should be looking at, coming out of it, and that it stacks up. I mean, ultimately, people with any of these tools, the main thing you need to remember is that the human at the end of it needs to remain A, the objective setter, and B, the sole decision maker.
Right.
You don't let the tail wag the dog. Ultimately, it's there as a tool to help you make your lives easier, but you're the person that's setting the objective and actually making the decisions.
So from what's moving on, from what you're seeing happening in different teams, and I know you've got a lot of experience, across the piece, should integration of AI into the finance function, is that part of a long-term strategy that you're looking at? You're gradually adding it in or seeing where it can be used, or is it something that it'll be used now and then things will move on, and that won't be so much part of things in the future?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, another phrase that you hear a lot is that we live in a time of cutting edge obsolescence. And whereas things used to sort of be developed and then they'd last quite a long time. Yeah, that time frame of things coming in and then being superseded is getting shorter and shorter and shorter all the time. That said, I don't think this is going away. And whether you incorporate it into your business, into your processes, I think again the question comes back to what do you want to achieve? What do you want your process to look like? Understand what your business requirement is first. And if AI is the right tool to deliver that business requirement, great. But it might not be, And I think there's a danger that people feel that they need to jump onto the bandwagon. We've got to do this because everyone else is doing it. It might be the right thing for your business. It might not.
Right.
It's a very specific thing that you need to look at on an individual basis.
And would that individual basis, I mean, would it be more likely that AI would help in mass volumes of stuff, or not necessarily?
It can do, yes, it can do. I mean, if it's something very transactional, you probably don't need AI to do it. You can do it with more simple RPA based approach. Where RPA falls down is that it's fantastic at processing very high volumes with great accuracy, as long as you can be very specific about the rules and the parameters. And then obviously then you build in what the exceptions. If it falls outside those parameters, you get an exception. The better you can define it, the smaller that exception process is. Where RPA is not so great is things like free text. Interpreting free text. That is it's not so hot at. So I mean, a thing that we, when I was doing RPA a few years back, one of the things that we really wanted to try and do was to have within the context of AP, they are for that matter, as almost like a case management tool. Emails coming in, sorting them, and then dealing with them, and then working out how you wanted to actually sort of forward those things. That in itself was very difficult to do with RPA. That becomes much more possible with AI because it's got the natural language processing ability. And if you feed it with a big enough data set, you can increasingly get it statistically more accurate. So, having something that can read emails that are coming in the inbox, deciding what you want to do with them, forwarding them to the right team, all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
okay. Let's move on a little bit to, so you're pretty convinced you're going to investigate a little bit. You are going to see where you can make use of AI, where it might fit in. What controls do you need to make sure are in place so it doesn't become that tail wagging the dog or out of anybody's control, if you like? I mean, that's a doomsday scenario. I don't mean quite that way out of control, but so that it's not being useful because you don't really know what you're getting out of it. What controls do you need?
I think first of all, I think it's first and foremost, you give some thought to having a policy, an AI or an automation policy for your organisation. Some organisations have an internal board or an ethical council, that sort of structure to decide what policy, governance, and guidelines you want to put around all of this. And I think it's definitely worthwhile to think about that before you sort of jump in, so that you've got some guidelines that you're working within first of all. And I think there's a very big difference then between how you have sort of the management and the governance around a specific program of work that you've done using AI with a particular end in sight, where it's been managed as a project, and that's just down to just good project management processes and disciplines, as opposed to allowing people access to an open source platform.
Right.
And it's going to be very different in terms of the governance that you need for each of those things. So where it's the open source, you have to have things like, who are you going to give access to? Are you going to allow people just to all have access and put ChatGPT, for example, on their work laptop? Or are you going to keep it to a much smaller, specific number of people who, have the skills and the background and perhaps the IT sort of discipline to understand, how to use it and how not to use it? What are you going to allow people just to, once they've got it, to do what they want, or are you going to have some sort of control over it? Do you do it as almost as a program, as opposed to giving people to say, right, off you go? And it's the same argument really that we had with RPA. When RPA started, there was two schools of thought. One was that you manage the introduction of it through a very tightly controlled program. Another one was you get half a dozen people who've got some sort of basic programming skills, give them the tool and say, right, off you go. And I've seen both. I've seen both happen in different companies. They can both work, but again, you have to have very different disciplines to make sure that it works well.
And presumably keeping oversight of all of that. I mean, if you have a policy in place, if you say who can have it on their laptop or not, you need to follow up those policies and have some kind of monitoring system that very carefully shows you what is happening and where it is. So that's another level of control, isn't it, that you need to make provision for.
And if your company has a chief security officer within the technology team, that would naturally fall within their remit. Depending on the size of the company, you may not have one of those. And so if you haven't, then you need to understand who's going to pick up the responsibility for doing that. Because, as I say, there is a danger that you can end up very quickly giving away a lot of information that you really didn't want to, and there's no return. There's no off switch once you've done it.
Can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Okay.
Entirely right.
So I'm sitting in a finance team. I'm wanting to put my toe in the water, and we know that a third of the people out there have. On that team, do you need to look out for particular expertise and knowledge before you get going, or particular aptitudes? Are there any different skills that we're kind of looking for these days?
I think certainly in my experience, it's if you've got somebody who has a background in any sort of programming, coding, it's the same skill set essentially.
Right.
It's that logical mindset of the way of framing something in a very specific way. That's kind of the key skill that you need. And I say, most companies will have. You don't necessarily. I say it's getting much easier in the fact you don't necessarily have to be able to code. So whereas before, or even with some of the RPA tools like UiPath and stuff like that, it's you need a certain level of coding ability to actually, create the robots, for example. Whereas when you're using an open source platform, that's not so much the case because you feed it with conversational type questions. So, but even though you don't need the coding ability, the structured mindset I think is the same in both.
Right. So
you'll get the best out of it if you've got people with those skills using it.
So is that nudging traditional skills in a slightly different direction when we're looking for people to come onto teams? Let's talk about that now, the implication, the effects that more and more use of AI will have on people and on business. So on the roles, some roles, let's not beat about the bush, some roles will disappear, won't they?
Yeah, and some already are to a degree, or certainly reducing in number. So things like automation and so forth have been around for some years now. So a lot of companies, the days of having a room full of people all sat there sort of doing their invoices is kind of a thing of the past in most cases because there's some form of automation. So this really is just another progression on beyond that. But I think the thing that I suppose we need to sort of remember and not get sort of too doomsday about it is that all of these tools still need someone to sort of be in control, to be in charge, to set the direction, to understand the outputs, and then to act on those outputs. So, no matter what tool you're using, and I think so. So, really, the skills that people increasingly need are that more critical, logical, analytical sort of skill, as opposed to the more sort of, I suppose, the more mundane type activities. Okay. But I don't think that's anything new. Really. I think it's more of an ongoing progression of what we've been seeing for the last decade or so.
And as AI becomes more part of the function and the process, do you see it being the responsibility of specific roles and teams or integrated into the whole operation? Or will it depend? I mean, talk us through how some of that might work.
So typically, I think, most of this stuff still tends up to be within the remit of an IT type function, or IT people embedded within technical people embedded within finance. But the users of it, tend to be almost everybody. So if you've created some sort of automation within your process, the people that are doing all those transactional tasks will be the people that are operating this automation. But you don't necessarily need to have understand how it was created in order to use it. So everybody gets involved, but I think there's two parts. One is the creation of it, which tends to be with the technical team. And similarly, once you've created it, no matter what it is, whether it's RPA, intelligent automation, AI, it needs to be supported on an ongoing basis. Again, so that it's like it's all very exciting when you start to create these things. It's the really boring side of it is the fact that you now
okay. You faded away from us again, Rod.
Sorry, I'll try and I'm moving around.
That's right. You're getting overexcited.
I'm getting excited again. Yes. I think you've got to when you create all these things, you have to then have a BAU team there to support it, and that's something that you need to think about right from the start and not to underestimate it. In fact, certainly in my experience, that's the reason why a lot of companies, when they look to get to scale on things like automation, that's the main reason that it doesn't happen. Is because you create a few automations and it's all very exciting, but then actually the boring stuff about maintaining it, running it, monitoring it, all that sort of stuff, that support that has to be set around it. And whether it's any sort of system needs that, whether it's AI or not, and AI is no different. So that would still traditionally fall within that realm of the technology support teams.
Okay. How would you advise people to go about getting the information they need? Because you can't look at a process and want a process, commission a process without understanding enough about it to know what you're asking for or how you need to talk to people about it. How are people getting the skills, the experience of AI that they need? Or how would you suggest they go about getting them?
I think there's many routes. I mean, one is just typical sort of training type, just through things like LinkedIn Learning and stuff like that. I mean, there's loads of stuff on there that you can have access to. Networks as well. I mean, personally, I'm a big fan of the network. If you've got somebody that you either know through your LinkedIn network or elsewhere who is involved in this, just talk to them, find out, ask questions, get them to come along and explain it to you. So that was what we did within our organisation. The guy in my team sort of did this sort of stuff personally because he was he did presentations to the entire finance community about what it is and how to use it and how to use it safely. So it's I think there's no real substitute, I don't think, for face-to-face contact or virtual face-to-face contact of understanding people who've been there.
And examples and see how things are actually working and how that might be different or slightly different from the processes and things you're doing. As it's been the Rod show, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm sorry that Peter couldn't join us. But before you go, what do you think are currently the biggest challenges facing the use of AI? What your top problem with it?
I think the biggest challenge for finance teams is around security and security governance. And it's not a particularly exciting topic, is it? But it's one of those that if you get it wrong, it goes horribly wrong. I think that's the single biggest thing that people, because things are so easily available now, and it's so much more open source compared to with the way things were a few years ago. I think that's the biggest challenge that people have.
Okay.
And it's one they need to be. So even if they're not, it's not in their strategy necessarily to use AI, people who have an interest in it are probably using it anyway.
Okay.
So I think it's don't bury your head in the sand that it's not something you're doing. You may well be and just not know about it.
Okay. And if you've raised your head out of the sand and you are going to take those first steps, what would you advise someone? What would the first step for them be? If you listen to a bit of what you're saying today, it seems inevitable. You're prepared to go and find out about it. What would be the first steps to making the most of using AI, would you suggest?
I think have a test case. Have an area within your processes that you want to improve. You understand exactly what it is that you want to do, and then go and have a look and talk about people about some different ways of doing it. Either canvas opinion within your network, people who've already put things in, and just have a go. Have a go in a controlled way. I think that's definitely the best way to do it. Start small, make sure that you're comfortable with it, but have a specific end in mind so that you can then, because apart from anything else, that gives you the tools then to go back to the business and say, we've done this was a great success, now we can do more, and you've got a use case then to actually sort of tell the story.
Okay. Rod, thanks very much indeed. Rod Chadwick. I'm sorry that Peter Drummond from Quadient AP couldn't join us. Perhaps we'll talk to him on another occasion. Thanks to you all for joining us. For more information on membership and courses, please head to the IFOL website. And this webinar will be available on the IFOL website from tomorrow. Please do share with any colleagues. And we'll send a link to top suggestions and a PDF of best practice guide. So for today, thanks very much.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.